I was thinking to myself the other day, this is kind of almost a fun thought experiment. What are the three most disconcerting ideas that anyone has ever come up with? And by disconcerting, I mean that they turn your familiar categories upside down. I think that when I think about it, the two of these ideas come from science, and a third comes from philosophy. And in fact, I would award the philosopher, in this case, the first prize. So in this segment, I want to talk about the two scientific ideas, and then I want to turn to the philosophical idea in the next couple of segments. And the first idea coming from science is Darwin's theory of evolution. And Darwin's theory of evolution, in a way, is both unbelievably simple and yet extremely discombobulating. It's said that a London aristocrat, the wife of one of the London royalty, someone described to her Darwin's theory and described it somewhat crudely as human beings are descended from apes. Not quite what Darwin says. Darwin really says that humans and apes have a common ancestor, which is not quite the same thing. But nevertheless, she gets this theory and she goes, "My dear, let us hope it is not true. But if it is true, let us pray it does not become widely known." In other words, she felt it was humiliating to human dignity, this idea that we're special, for humans to have this sort of, well, I think Darwin himself uses the phrase lowly origin. Now, there are Christians who are very uneasy about this idea of evolution because they believe that if it happened by evolution, it couldn't have been done by God. I think actually this does not follow. There is no reason that God can't use, quite frankly, whatever mechanism he chooses to create us as humans. Just as God could have used whatever mechanism he chose to make the universe. People don't say things like, well, it's either the Big Bang or God did it. No, God could have used the Big Bang to do it. God could have used the laws of physics and the laws of nature to produce a universe. And similarly, God could have used the laws of nature, in this case, the laws of evolution, to produce human beings. Now, none of this would imply that human beings don't have dignity or any of that. Evolution was an idea that preceded Darwin. Darwin's own grandfather talked about evolution. Other people talked about it. The French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck thought that evolution occurred because acquired traits could then be passed on. He kind of imagined something like this: food runs short in an animal community. Giraffes then begin to stretch their necks to reach out for the food. This stretching action slightly increases the reach of their neck, and then they pass along the stretch to the baby giraffe. Except that it doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter what traits you acquire in your life. You don't pass those on to your children. So this was an erroneous. The problem with evolution was describing how it occurred. The genius of Darwin is to realize it occurred, but not that way. It occurred because when there's a competition for food, those creatures that are more adapted to their environment, have a better ability, you may say, to survive. Those are the ones that do survive. And then those are the ones that reproduce. And so ultimately, evolution is a kind of a genius way of explaining how, when you get to certain places, you find creatures, and this is not just humans, obviously, but animals that are beautifully adapted to their environment. And Darwin's answer is, of course, that's because they evolved in that environment. So now, Darwin, by the way, wasn't the sole guy to come up with evolution. It was co-discovered by another guy, not as famous as Darwin, in fact, hardly known, the British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace. In fact, it was Wallace who wrote Darwin and said, "Hey, I've got a great idea. Here's what it is." Now, it's not that Darwin got the idea from Wallace, but Darwin had been working on this idea in a major book, but Darwin was kind of a stickler, and he hadn't published his book. But suddenly he realized another guy has come up independently with the same idea. So Darwin, who was a gentleman, essentially told Wallace, "Listen, why don't we jointly present this idea, which you have independently arrived at, but I've been working on, and that became what we now know as the theory of evolution. So that's Darwin. I think a very interesting and profound and powerful idea. It is not an idea that needs to frighten us as Christians in any way. It simply describes the mechanism in which God works in and through nature. Now, let's turn to the second idea, which is the genius of Einstein. And Einstein's real genius is what is known as the general theory of relativity, which is a little too complex to go into here, but I want to talk about the initial insight that led to Einstein's special theory of relativity, which came first. The special theory of relativity around 1905, a general theory of relativity about 9 years later. But the special theory of relativity is stunning in and of itself. And it's not special in the sense that, oh, it's special, it's like amazing. No, not special like that. Special in that it applies to a special case. And the special case is basically, it applies to objects that are moving in a straight line at constant speed. So that's what's special about special relativity. Now let's think about this. If I'm standing on a railway station and a train is going by me at 40 miles an hour and I measure its speed, I'm going to get 40 miles an hour. Now, if I'm sitting in a train that's going alongside the other train and my train is going at 20 miles an hour and the other train is going at 40 miles an hour, what will the speed of the other train be relative to me from my point of view? Well, the answer is obviously 20 miles an hour. Why? Because I'm running alongside the train at 20 miles an hour. So the train for me is only going at 20 miles an hour in addition to my speed. But now Einstein raises a remarkable question. What if I'm standing on the same railway station and I measure the speed of light? The speed of light, says Einstein, is a known speed. Let's call it speed c, 186,000 miles a second. I measure it as c. Now, says Einstein, what if I'm riding in that same train at 20 miles an hour and I measure the speed of light? Einstein says I should get speed c minus 20. Why? Because I'm going at 20 miles an hour alongside the light beam. But, says Einstein, that's not what I get. I still get c. And then, says Einstein, what if I'm riding in a spaceship that's traveling at, let's say, half the speed of light, and I'm going alongside a light beam? I should, in common sense, get a speed of light measured at half c. Why? Because I'm going at half the speed of light alongside the beam. But, says Einstein, no, I will in fact get speed c. And think about this. You have three different people, one stationary, one in a train going 20 miles an hour, and one going at half the speed of light. And they're all measuring the same light beam, and they get the same answer. And it is that stunning insight that leads Einstein to all the remarkable conclusions about the fact that there isn't such a distinct thing as space. There isn't such a distinct thing as time. Space and time are relative to the observer. And then later in general relativity, Einstein develops even more far-out concepts, space-time. Gravity, he says, is the, quote, curvature of space-time. So these are the remarkable, exciting, exhilarating, once you get the germ of it. It's really fun to think about and read because this is the world we live in. All the complex things that we do won't work if we didn't know about Darwin's theory of evolution and Einstein's theory of relativity. These aren't theories in the sense that they're maybe true and maybe not. They're theories in the sense that they provide an explanatory framework for facts. So these are two of the most disconcerting ideas ever presented. For the third one, we have to turn to the field of philosophy, and that's coming up next.